The first thing he noticed was her hands. They were pressed flat against the metal of his door, knuckles split, fingers trembling with a fine constant vibration that had nothing to do with cold. He'd seen hands like that before, not on humans, but on the livestock they used to process through the Ketzer facility on the eastern ridge, the ones that had been standing for days without water, just barely alive enough to remain on their feet. Her hands looked like that. Pressed to the door of the bunker he was not supposed to be in the district he was not supposed to occupy, in a city that was not supposed to matter to anyone anymore. She said something. The translator node behind his left ear was slow to wake. He'd had to ration its power cells since the secondary depot burned, and he caught only the last half of it. The words that reached him were, "I can cook. I can clean. Just don't send me back." Then she went down. Sergeant Merkdara caught her before her head hit the ground. He did it without deciding to. His hands moved and she was in his arms, and then he was carrying her inside, and the door sealed behind him with a soft, exhausted wheeze like the bunker itself was holding its breath. He hadn't used his real name in 4 months. The station had belonged to the Karath Survey Division before the occupation, a deep rock atmospheric monitoring post carved into the basalt 300 meters below the city's old financial quarter. The city had been called Novik Station once. Now it didn't have a name on any Karath map he'd intercepted. It was designated Processing Zone 7. The Karath liked clean designations. They liked to remove the things that made a place feel like it had ever been lived in. He'd found the station by accident, fleeing a sweep team in the upper Warrens after the Crosspoint ambush went wrong. 6 soldiers had gone in. He'd come out alone, and he'd run until his legs stopped working, and when they stopped working, he'd fallen through a maintenance hatch that no Karath scanner would ever find because it was buried under 40 years of compacted urban sediment and didn't technically exist on any map built after 2041. The station had been empty. The power cells had been at 11%. There was enough dried food to sustain one person for roughly 3 months. He'd told himself he would leave in a week. He was still here. He set her down on the cot he'd assembled from salvaged components in the secondary chamber. He put 2 fingers to her neck and found a pulse, fast and shallow, but there. He checked her eyes. One was brown. The other had the faint silver sheen of a Karath behavioral implant, the kind they installed during processing, the subdermal disc that sat against the optic nerve and could trigger anything from nausea to compliance to full motor shutdown if the controlling officer decided your behavior warranted correction. He sat back on his heels and looked at her for a long moment. She was young, maybe 22. Human, obviously. The Karath had not yet mastered the particular asymmetry of the human face, the way no 2 features quite mirrored each other, the slight unevenness that was not flaw but signature. She wore a secondary-tier service uniform, the pale gray of a domestic worker assigned to a Karath administrative facility. Her name badge had been torn off. Her feet were wrapped in what looked like strips of a thermal blanket because her shoes were gone. She'd walked to him across the lower Warrens in the dark, in the cold, without shoes. He did not ask himself why she'd chosen his door. He already understood that she hadn't chosen it. She'd gone door to door in the dark until one of them opened. He found her a blanket and water and a protein block from his dwindling stores, and he sat in the outer chamber while she slept, and he thought about the 3 things he could reasonably do. He could turn her out. He could report her location to the underground network, if it still existed, if anyone was still answering that particular frequency. Or he could let her stay until she was strong enough to tell him what she was running from, and then make a decision. He was still thinking when she woke up. Her name was Solis. That was all she'd give him at first. Just Solis, delivered with the flat, careful blankness of someone who has learned that the amount of information you share is the amount of leverage you hand over. He recognized the posture. He'd worn it himself. He told her his name was Calloway. It was the name on the ID chip he'd taken from a dead man outside the ruins of the Novik Secondary Hospital 6 weeks ago. The man had been a civilian technician named Pel Calloway, and he'd been dead long enough that his features had softened past recognition, which meant Dara had taken the chip and slotted it into his own subdermal tag socket and become Pel Calloway in every database the Karath checked. The real Merc Dara was listed as killed in the Crosspoint engagement. He checked, periodically. The record had not changed. Being dead had certain advantages. "How long have you had the implant?" he said. He didn't make it a question. She looked at him without flinching. 14 months. "Can you feel it?" "Sometimes, when they run the compliance check, it's like a finger pressing on the inside of your eye." He nodded. He'd heard this described before. He had nothing useful to say about it. "Does it transmit passively?" "Only within range of a Karath monitoring tower. If I'm more than 2 kilometers from the nearest tower, it goes dormant." She paused. "I counted the towers on my way here. There's a dead zone in the lower warrens, about 3 blocks wide." He looked at her more carefully. "You mapped the dead zone." "I worked in the administrative archive for 11 months before they moved me to personal service. I had access to the infrastructure registry." She said it without inflection, as if she were reciting a shopping list, as if what she had just described, 11 months of quiet, methodical information gathering inside the nerve center of an alien occupation government, were simply something she had done to pass the time. "What did you do before the occupation?" he said. A long pause. "Urban infrastructure management. I was finishing my doctorate." He thought about that. He thought about an infrastructure management doctoral candidate spending 11 months memorizing the layout of a Karath administrative network. And he thought about what a person like that would know. And he thought about all the things the underground had been trying to find out for the past 2 years. "All right," he said, "you can stay." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're not going to ask what I'm running from." "I expect you'll tell me when you decide to." She told him on the 3rd day. Not because she'd decided to trust him, he thought, but because the weight of it had become heavier than the cost of sharing it. She told him in the same flat, careful voice she used for everything, sitting cross-legged on the cot with a cup of recycled water and a protein block, and what she told him was this. Her name was not Solis. Her name was Solis Myra Yen, and she had survived the Novik station processing sweeps because an administrative Karath named Velashar had flagged her education credentials and pulled her out of the labor assignment queue and put her to work in the archive division. She had spent 11 months in the archive. She had spent those months doing her actual job, cataloging and cross-referencing the Karath administrative database, because the only way to survive was to be genuinely useful, and the only way to be genuinely useful was to actually do the work. And in doing the work she had learned things. She had learned the layout of every processing facility in the city. She had learned the rotation schedules of the labor supervisors. She had learned which facilities were designated as permanent and which were designated as temporary, and she had learned that temporary, in Karath administrative language, did not mean what it sounded like it meant. Temporary meant scheduled for termination once the resource extraction quota was met. She had learned that Zone 7's quota was 91% fulfilled. "How long?" Dara said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. He sat very still. "There's more," she said. There was more. The Karath were not, it turned out, planning a simple shutdown of the processing facilities. Karath administrative doctrine held that permanent populations created long-term security liabilities. The termination protocol for a processing zone included comprehensive biological neutralization, not execution, nothing so direct, nothing that would show up cleanly in a war crimes audit, but a cascade of environmental adjustments that would make the zone unsurvivable over a period of approximately 10 days. Atmospheric processors set to gradual oxygen reduction. Water filtration systems switched to a compound that bioaccumulated in human tissue. Heat management systems disabled in winter. Slow deniable complete. "Did you take anything," he said, "from the archive?" She reached into the lining of the service uniform and produced a data sliver no bigger than a thumbnail. She held it up between two fingers. "Everything I could get without triggering an access alert," she said. "The termination order, the facility layouts, the supervisor rotation schedule, the atmospheric processor access codes." He stared at the sliver. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "If I had this, why was I running to random doors in the dark?" "I wasn't thinking that." "You were." He almost smiled. "I was thinking that you took an extraordinary risk. I was thinking that whatever made you decide to take that risk must have been immediate and serious." A silence. Outside, somewhere far above them, he could hear the low harmonic of a Karath patrol skimmer making its night circuit through the upper warrens. "They moved me from the archive," she said, "6 days ago, personal service assignment, to a senior administrative officer." Another pause longer than the others. He was not interested in good work. Dara said nothing. There was nothing worth saying. "I took the sliver 3 months ago," she said. "I've been waiting for a reason to run." She set down her water cup. "I found a reason." He took the data sliver and slotted it into his terminal and spent 6 hours reading. When he was done, he sat in the outer chamber in the dark for a long time, very still, the way he'd learned to be still in the years before the occupation, when he'd been a different kind of soldier in a different kind of war, a war where the enemy was at least the same species and you could sometimes predict them. The Karath were not predictable in any way that corresponded to human psychology. They did not hate. They did not resent. They had not come to this planet out of anything so comprehensible as fear or greed. They had come because their actuarial models had identified it as resource optimal, and they had occupied it with the brisk efficiency of a corporation moving into a new market, and they had implemented their processing protocols with the same emotional temperature as someone filling out a quarterly report. The horror of it, the specific thing that kept him awake at 3 in the morning in this hollow underground station, was not their cruelty. It was their indifference. They were not cruel. They were simply thorough. He thought about the 6,000 people in Zone 7's processing facilities. He thought about Velishar. He'd heard the name before. He'd heard it from the underground, from a contact he'd had before Crosspoint, a woman named Yes who'd had access to the administrative quarter and who'd told him 3 months ago that there was a Karath archivist who had been asking questions that were not part of her official function. Questions about human cultural practices. Questions about grief. Questions about the specific rituals humans used to mark the deaths of individuals. The way they cataloged the specific details of a person's life, rather than simply noting the cessation of biological function. Velishar had been asking, in essence, why humans found it necessary to remember the dead. He had not known what to make of this information at the time. He had filed it in the part of his mind where he stored things that didn't fit and waited for them to resolve themselves into something comprehensible. Now, looking at Soli's Myra, Yen sitting on a salvaged cot in an underground station with a data sliver that could change everything, he thought he understood. "Tell me about her," he said, "the archivist." Solis looked at him. "You know about Velishar." "I know of her. Tell me what she's like." A long pause. "Careful," Solis said finally. "Quiet. She doesn't move the way most of them move. They move like they're conserving energy, everything minimal. She moves like she's paying attention to something, like she's listening." She turned the empty water cup in her hands. "She asked me once what I missed from before. I told her I missed the sound of traffic. She didn't understand why that would be something to miss." A pause. "I don't think she was asking to be cruel. I think she genuinely wanted to understand." "Did you tell her that you were planning to run?" "No." "Did she know?" Solis was quiet for a moment. I think she suspected. The day before I left, she put an access log through my workstation that would account for 12 hours of unverified time. She didn't say anything. She just did it. She looked at the wall. Maybe it was a coincidence. Dara thought about a Karath archivist who asked questions about grief, and who might or might not have quietly created a 12-hour window for a human subordinate to disappear. It wasn't a coincidence, he said. He contacted the underground on the 4th day. He'd been avoiding it, not because he doubted the underground's existence, but because contact meant exposure and exposure meant risk, and he'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to convince himself that his only obligation was to survive. He'd been telling himself that for 4 months. He was running out of belief in it. The frequency was still active. The response came back in the old cipher, the one they'd set up before Crosspoint, which meant at least some of the old network had survived. The reply was a single string of location coordinates and a time. He went alone. He didn't tell Solis. She was waiting for him when he got back. I know you contacted someone, she said. The terminal has a residual heat signature from a tight beam transmission. He looked at her. You checked the terminal. I checked the terminal. He pulled off his outer jacket and sat down. I went to a meet, underground. I gave them the data. She was very still. You copied it first. Of course I copied it first. He rubbed his face. There's a cell 3 kilometers east of here. 12 people. They have a working uplink to the outer system. If we can get the termination order and the facility layouts out to the Federated Assembly observers, there's a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance, that they can apply enough diplomatic pressure to delay the protocol. It won't stop it. But it might buy time. For what? For us to stop it ourselves. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that he was beginning to recognize as her version of assessment. The same methodical scanning she probably applied to everything, sorting and cataloging, and deciding what category a thing belonged in. You were special forces, she said. Past tense. What happened? He thought about Crosspoint. He thought about the 6 people who had gone in and the one who had come out. He thought about the choices he'd made in that facility, the ones that had kept him alive and the ones that hadn't kept the others alive, and whether there was a meaningful difference between those 2 categories or whether they were the same choice described from different angles. I made a mistake, he said. I survived it, the others didn't. She nodded once slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. What do you need? She said. He told her. What he needed was access. The atmospheric processor nodes for Zone 7 were controlled from 3 physical terminals, each located inside a Karath administrative facility. 2 of the terminals were deep in the occupied quarter, unreachable without a Karath escort clearance. But the 3rd terminal was in a substation on the edge of the lower Warrens, a repurposed human infrastructure building that the Karath had absorbed into their network because it was easier than building new. It ran on a hybrid system, Karath software mapped onto human hardware architecture, which meant it had gaps, seams, places where the Karath programming had been fitted over human engineering, like a suit that didn't quite fit. I know that building, Solis said immediately. It's in the infrastructure registry, substation 7 Bravo. I have the schematic. Of course she did. He went back to the underground contact the following morning and returned with 3 things. A fresh power cell for the translator node, a schematic of the Upper Warrens patrol schedule that was 2 weeks out of date but better than nothing, and the information that the outer system relay was intermittently functional and that someone on the other end was listening. The underground cell was smaller than he'd hoped. The Crosspoint losses had taken more than just his team, had taken the infrastructure of resistance itself, the safe houses and the couriers and the mid-level contacts who knew who to call when something needed to move, but it was still there. 12 people in a repurposed maintenance shaft, still transmitting, still recording, still refusing to stop mattering. He didn't tell them about Velashar yet. Some information needed to be held until it was necessary. He'd learned this slowly and painfully over years of this particular kind of work. The more people who knew a thing, the more surfaces it had to be lost from. When he got back, Solis was awake and had reorganized the terminal files into a system that made considerably more sense than the system he'd been using, which had been less a system than a series of panicked decisions about what to put where during the months when he'd been focused entirely on not dying. She had also found, in the recessed storage behind the secondary chamber wall, a cache of supplies that the previous occupants had left when they abandoned the station. Concentrated protein packs, water filtration tablets, a medical kit still sealed in its original packaging. She had inventoried them precisely and laid them out in the order of likely utility and written the quantities on a piece of substrate in the same careful hand she used for everything. He stood in the doorway and looked at the laid-out supplies. "The medical kit is mostly intact," she said without looking up. "There's a bone knit applicator and 3 doses of broad-spectrum antiparasitic, useful if we make it to the facilities." "When we make it to the facilities." She looked up at that. Something shifted in her expression, not quite belief, not yet, but the beginning of the calculation that led to belief. "When," she said. "They spent 3 days planning." He was surprised to find that she was easy to plan with, not because she was agreeable. She wasn't particularly agreeable. She argued with him frequently, and with a precision that suggested she had spent years in rooms full of engineers who would dismiss a weak argument, and she had learned to have no weak arguments. But because she thought the way he thought, in systems and contingencies, in the specific shape of what could go wrong and what you did when it did. On the second evening, she asked him about his soldiers. He didn't ask her how she knew. She was an infrastructure management specialist who had spent 11 months memorizing an administrative network. Reading people was not a different skill from reading systems. It was the same skill applied to a more complicated kind of architecture. He told her, not the details of Crosspoint, not yet, but the names, Frederica and Jonas and Tamsin and Peter and Lynn. He said each name once, the way he always did, and she listened without interrupting, which was rarer than he expected from someone who processed information as aggressively as she did. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Were you their commanding officer?" "Yes." "And you believe you could have gotten them out?" He thought about this. He had thought about it nearly every day for 4 months. "I believe I made a choice that I thought gave us the best probability of completing the mission. I believe that choice was correct given the information I had at the time. I also believe that 5 people are dead." He paused. "Both of those things are true. I have not yet found a way to make them sit in the same room without fighting." She looked at him with the careful assessing attention she gave to everything. "The infrastructure management doctoral program," she said, "required a practicum, a real project. I spent 8 months on a flood mitigation system for a district in the old port quarter. I was very thorough. I ran every model I had. And then there was a storm surge that was outside the parameters of any of my models, and 14 people had to be evacuated from buildings I had certified as safe." A pause. "No one died. But for about 6 hours, before the evacuation was complete, I did not know that no one would die." He looked at her. "I'm not comparing those things," she said. "I know they are not the same. I am saying that I understand the specific experience of having been correct by the only available measure and still carrying the weight of the outcome." She picked up her water cup. "I don't think that weight goes away. I think you learn to carry it without it changing your stride." He didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's a useful way to think about it," he said finally. "I know," she almost smiled again. "I'm very useful." On the third evening, she found the collection of signal-captured images he kept in the tertiary folder of his terminal. He hadn't tried to hide them. He'd had no reason to think anyone else would be here to find them. She looked at the images for a long time without saying anything. They were portraits, or they had been portraits before the occupation, photographs of people, hundreds of them, recovered from the Novik Station Public Memorial Archive before the Karath dismantled it. He'd captured them on a salvage run months ago, not because he'd had a clear use for them, but because it had seemed wrong to let them disappear. Names and faces and fragments of biographical data. A civil engineer who'd once saved a city block from flooding by solving an infrastructure problem with 3 zip ties and lateral thinking. A pediatric nurse who'd driven her own car to a shelter during the evacuation and made 17 trips before the roads closed. A teacher. A retired sailor. A woman who'd apparently been famous locally for growing tomatoes of improbable size. The dead specifically cataloged. The Karath archivist, Solis said, Velashar, she asked me about this, about why we do this. She was quiet for a moment. I told her it was because names were how we made the dead matter, that if you knew someone's name they weren't gone all the way. A pause. She wrote it down. He looked at the images. What did she say? She said, we do not have this. When one of ours ends, we record the cessation and close the file. She said it very matter-of-factly. But she was quiet for a long time after. Solis turned away from the images. I don't think she meant it as a criticism. I think she stopped. Grieving, he said, in the only way she knew how. She looked at him. Something ended for her, he said. Something she was told shouldn't matter and she's trying to understand why it does. A long silence. You should sleep, he said. We go in 2 days. He didn't sleep. He sat in the outer chamber with the images on the terminal screen, the faces of Novik Station's dead, and he thought about what it meant to fight for people you'd never met, and whether the grief he'd been carrying since Crosspoint was a wound or a compass, and whether there was a meaningful difference between those 2 things either. He thought about his soldiers. Their names were Frederica Osai and Jonas Brandt and Tamsin Kowalczyk and Peter Vance and Lynn Nguyen. He said them in his head like a prayer, or like a list, or like both. He'd been saying them every night for 4 months. He would keep saying them. He didn't know exactly why, only that to stop would be to make a decision he wasn't prepared to make. He thought about 6,000 people in Zone 7, and the atmospheric processors slowly being recalibrated, and the water filtration systems and the cold. He thought not here, not these names. On the night before they were supposed to move, someone knocked on the door. His hand was on his sidearm before the knock finished. He moved to the door panel and pulled up the exterior sensor, a cheap jury-rigged thing he'd assembled from salvaged components. The image it returned was poor but legible. Standing outside his door was a Karath. Not a patrol officer, not in combat chassis. This one was in the administrative configuration, smaller, the secondary manipulators folded close, the bioluminescent communication organs along the neck, and jaw dimmed to a low, steady amber that meant something he had once been told was the Karath equivalent of raised hands. I am not here to fight. It stood in the dead zone, the implant monitoring range that Solis had mapped. He looked at Solis. She was already at the door, already reading the sensor image, and her face had gone very still with an expression he didn't have a word for. Velashar, she said. He kept his hand on his weapon. Does she know about this place? She knew I had found somewhere to go. I didn't tell her where. A pause. She found it herself. He thought about that. A Karath archivist, an infrastructure registry, the same methodology Solis had used to survive, turned outward. He opened the door. Velashar moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has thought about every step of this moment and is executing it exactly as planned, which is to say she moved like someone who was frightened and was managing it with discipline. She stepped inside. The door sealed. Her communication organs dimmed further, to a color he had no reference for. The translator node gave him her first words as, I know what the protocol is. I know when it begins. I know you have the access codes." He said, "Why are you here?" A long pause. The bioluminescence shifted through several colors quickly. The translator gave him, "Because I wrote down what she told me. That names are how we make the dead matter, and I have been thinking about 6,000 names." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want?" he said. Another pause. The colors steadied on something the translator rendered as, "I want to help you break it." Then she said something else. Something the translator struggled with. A phrase that the node rendered first as asterisk correction of a file, and then, after a moment of processing, offered a second translation, asterisk making it right. He looked at Solis. She was looking at Velashar with the same expression she'd been wearing at the door, the one he still didn't have a word for. Then she looked at him. "She has something we don't," Solis said quietly. "She has a Karath administrative ID. She can access the substation without triggering the intrusion protocol. We go in as her assistants." He thought about it. He thought about walking into a Karath administrative substation with a defecting Karath archivist and a human woman in a stolen service uniform, and a dead man's ID chip pressed against his own neck. He thought about all the ways this could end. He said, "Tell me exactly what you can access." Velashar told him. It took 40 minutes and 2 full passes through the translator node, and 1 diagram that Solis drew from memory on a piece of substrate. But by the end of it, he had a picture of what was possible, and it was larger than he'd expected and considerably more dangerous than he'd hoped. "All right," he said, "we go tomorrow night, 1 change to the plan." They looked at him. "We don't just reroute the atmospheric processors," he said. "We don't just delay the protocol, we expose it." He looked at the data sliver on the table. "We put the full termination order on the Karath administrative broadcast net. Every facility in this zone sees it simultaneously. The labor supervisors, the processing officers, every Karath administrative node in range. We make it visible." Solis understood immediately. The diplomatic observers. And the Karath Administrative Review Board, their own chain of command, because their protocol is deniable right up until it's documented and broadcast on their own network, and every observer in the outer system has a copy. He paused. They are thorough. They are also bureaucratic. A documented atrocity that has reached their own administrative record becomes a liability that their actuarial models will evaluate. And their actuarial models will determine that the cost of proceeding outweighs the benefit. "You're betting 6,000 lives on a bureaucratic calculation," Solis said. "I'm betting 6,000 lives on the one thing that has been consistent about them since first contact." He looked at her. "They do not make decisions that cost more than they return. Make the protocol cost more than it returns and they will not run it." A silence. "And if you're wrong," she said. "Then we're dead and 6,000 people are dead and I was wrong." He held her gaze. "But I don't think I'm wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Velashar. The archivist's communication organs cycled through the color the translator had given as making it right. "Okay," Solis said. The night they moved, Solis found him in the outer chamber at 2 in the morning doing the thing he'd always done before a difficult operation, which was to sit very still with his eyes closed and go through everything that needed to happen in order, every step, every contingency, every junction point where the plan could break and what the backup was when it did. It looked like sleep to someone who didn't know him. It looked like nothing, just a man sitting still in the dark. She sat down across from him and was quiet, and after a few minutes she closed her own eyes, and he understood that she was doing the same thing, just in her own version of the same language. They sat like that for 20 minutes. Then she said, without opening her eyes, "There's a service access panel on the east wall of the terminal room, behind the secondary workstation. It's in the schematic, but it's not in the Karath overlay maps, because it was added to the original structure after the Kareth infrastructure assessment. They don't know it's there. If the patrol officer at the entrance is replaced when we arrive, and the new one doesn't recognize Velashar on site, we go in through the access panel instead of the main corridor. It comes out 3 meters from the central workstation. He opened his eyes. How long have you known about the panel? I found it in the original construction permits, 2 days ago. You didn't mention it. I didn't need to until now. She opened her eyes. Now I'm mentioning it. He thought about this. He thought about a woman who spent 11 months in an administrative archive memorizing things she might never need and filing them carefully in case she ever did. And he thought about the specific kind of person that required. And he thought that he was very glad she had walked to his door in the dark. Noted, he said, let's go. Velashar was waiting for them at the arranged meeting point in the dead zone, standing in the cold with the patient stillness of a species that did not fidget. Her communication organs were dimmed to the amber of raised hands. She had come alone. He checked the time. The patrol schedule gave them a 12-minute window from the last sweep to the next. They had used 4 of those minutes getting here. Ready, he said. Velashar's secondary manipulators moved in a gesture that the translator didn't need to process. Universal, yes. Substation 7 Bravo looked exactly like what it was, a human-built utility structure that had been occupied and adapted by beings who found its architecture inefficient but acceptable. The original signage had been painted over in Kareth administrative gray. The original door hardware had been replaced. But the bones of it were human, the proportions of the corridors, the placement of the service access panels, the spacing of the structural columns, and Dara moved through it with the ease of someone who had spent years in buildings exactly like this, because he had. Velashar walked ahead of them with the composed authority of a senior administrative officer conducting a routine inspection. 2 human service personnel behind her. Nothing unusual. The patrol officer at the entrance had checked her credentials and stepped aside with the automatic deference that junior Kareth showed senior administrators, and they had walked through. The terminal room was on the sublevel. 3 workstations, all active, one occupied by a Kareth technical officer who turned at their entrance and began a query in administrative language that Velashar answered without breaking stride, and at a register of authority that made the technical officer become very still and then very busy looking at something else. Dara moved to the right workstation. Solis moved to the left. Velashar positioned herself at the central station and began working. He had 11 minutes before the next automated system check would flag an anomaly in the access logs. He had memorized exactly what needed to happen in those 11 minutes. He began. The atmospheric processor codes were in the 3rd administrative layer. Behind a secondary encryption that Solis had told him was a standard Kareth security protocol, and which she had also told him the bypass for, because she had found it in the infrastructure registry 8 months ago and memorized it because she memorized things. He ran the bypass, and the encryption dropped and he was in. He did not reroute the processors. He flagged every node simultaneously for emergency override, a command that would lock the processors into life safety maintenance mode, the setting they used when doing facility maintenance where human workers might be present, a setting that no automated audit would flag as hostile because it was explicitly a life safety measure. The processors would stabilize. The slow oxygen reduction would stop. It could be reversed, but reversing it would require a physical override at each node, and there were 47 nodes, and by the time anyone understood what had happened and began reversing them, the broadcast would already be out. He looked at the timer. 7 minutes. At the central workstation, Velashar was working with a focus he recognized, the specific stillness of someone doing something that they understand to be the most important thing they have ever done and possibly the last. She was compiling the broadcast package, the termination order, the facility layouts, the supervisor schedules, the atmospheric processor recalibration logs with their timestamps showing a deliberate incremental adjustment that could not be explained as maintenance error. The full administrative record of an atrocity, assembled with the precision of a trained archivist who knew exactly which documents needed to be in which format for which review board. She was, he realized, building a case, not a broadcast, a case. 5 minutes. At the left workstation, Solis had done something he hadn't asked her to do, and which was either genius or disaster. She'd found the personnel registry for Zone 7's processing facilities. The full registry, 6,143 names, with biographical data, with photographs where they existed, with the specific details of individual lives that the Karath had recorded because you needed to track your resources. She was attaching it to the broadcast. He looked at her, she looked at him. Names, she said, so they matter. 3 minutes. The technical officer at the occupied workstation made a sound, a query, or an alarm, he couldn't tell, and stood, and Velishar said something in administrative language that stopped the officer cold. He didn't ask her what she'd said. He didn't need to know. He needed to trust that she had bought them the time they needed. 2 minutes. He finished the processor override. He ran the confirmation check. All 47 nodes flagged. Life safety maintenance mode locked. He looked at Velishar. She made a single gesture with her secondary manipulator, the kind of gesture that needed no translation. He pressed transmit. The broadcast went out on the Karath administrative net, authenticated with a senior archivist's credentials, formatted precisely to the specifications of an official administrative notification, addressed to every administrative node within 600 kilometers, and simultaneously uplinked to the outer system relay that fed the Federated Assembly Observer mission and every independent monitoring body that was supposed to be watching and mostly wasn't. 6,143 names, the termination order, the logs, the full case. The technical officer took 2 steps toward them. Velishar stepped forward and said something in a language that Dara's translator node rendered only partially, but the meaning was clear from the officer's sudden stillness. Something like "this has already been sent," something like "you cannot unring a bell," something like "what is done is done." Then she said, quieter, the bioluminescence along her neck going very dim, something the translator gave him as, "I would like you to write my name down somewhere when this is over, so that it matters." He looked at her for a long moment. "I will," he said, "I promise." They left. The technical officer did not stop them, not out of compliance, he thought, but out of the specific Karath calculus that Velishar had named. The calculation of what stopping them would cost now, compared to what it would return, and the recognition that the numbers had changed. They were 3 blocks from the substation when the patrol skimmer came overhead. It didn't stop. He'd had time in the planning to think about what it would feel like to survive. He'd spent 4 months not thinking about it, operating on the working assumption that the most he could do was keep moving and keep making the small, precise decisions that added up over time to resistance. He had not thought about surviving because surviving was too large, too abstract, a horizon that kept receding every time you moved toward it. The 3 of them walked through the lower warrens in the cold and the quiet, and the patrol skimmer did not stop, and the dead zone held. And when they reached the bunker door, he stood for a moment with his hand on the seal and thought about 6,000 names, and the broadcast going out, and the diplomatic observers opening their terminals in the morning, and what the actuarial models would say. He thought about Frederica Osai and Jonas Brandt and Tamsin Kowalczyk, and Peter Vance and Lynn Nguyen. He thought here these names. He stood in the cold outside the bunker door for a moment longer than he needed to. The upper city was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a Karath patrol skimmer completed its circuit and turned south. a dim blue light passing behind the rooflines of buildings that had once been full of people going home. He thought about what it was that humans did that the Karath could not account for. It wasn't the physical capabilities. The Karath were bigger and better armed, and their technology was 2 generations ahead of anything humanity had fielded before the occupation. They had better processing speed, better material science, and a biological longevity that made a human lifetime look like a brief administrative note in a very long file. They had numbers and logistics and a coordination efficiency born of not carrying the overhead of individual emotional response. None of that was the variable they'd missed. The variable they had missed was this: humans could hold 2 contradictory things in mind simultaneously and be made stronger by the tension between them rather than paralyzed by it. Frederica and Jonas and Tamsin and Peter and Lynn were dead, and that was true, and it was his failure in some measure, and that was also true, and he was still here and still moving, and that was a third true thing. All 3 occupied the same space in him, and the weight of the first 2 was real and permanent, and did not go away, and the third thing happened anyway. Grief and continuation, not in sequence but in parallel, running on the same track, not canceling each other out. The Karath closed their files, humans carried theirs. That was the variable. That was why the actuarial models gave wrong answers. You could not calculate the behavior of a species that experienced loss as fuel rather than as subtraction. A species where the dead stayed present, where names were kept, where grief was not an inefficiency to be processed past but a compass that pointed, constantly, toward what mattered and why. They had looked at humanity and seen a species with shorter lives and slower cognition and inferior technology. They had looked at Crossbunt and seen a failed operation and 6 resources removed from the board. They had not looked at one surviving soldier, spending 4 months in an underground station keeping names. He let himself stand in the cold exactly as long as he needed to. Then he put his hand on the seal. They went inside. The response from the outer system relay came 41 hours later. Not a message, not a communication, but a verifiable shift in the Karath administrative broadcast net itself, logged and time-stamped and authentic. A temporary cessation order. Administrative hold on Zone 7 processing operations pending review, issued from a Karath senior administrative oversight body that had apparently found itself in possession of a very well-documented case and had run the numbers and found them unfavorable. Temporary pending review. He sat with that word for a long time. Temporary. It was the same word the Karath used for the processing zones. Temporary meaning scheduled for a particular kind of ending, but endings could be redirected. Endings were not fixed. He knew this because he was supposed to be dead and he was not dead, and the people in Zone 7 were supposed to be scheduled for termination, and they were not terminated. Not today, not by today's numbers. The response from the outer system relay was not the only thing that came back. There were others. A fragmentary signal from a resistance cell in a city 300 kilometers northeast, using a cipher he hadn't heard in 8 months, the cipher from before the occupation, the one they'd set up in the very first weeks when they'd still believed the response would be faster, that the help would come sooner, that this would be over before it became what it had become. The signal was short. It said only, received, confirmed, not alone. He sat with that for a long time. There was also a direct response from the Federated Assembly Observer mission, routed through 3 relay points to arrive without a clear origin signature. It was careful and diplomatic, and said nothing specific about timelines or interventions, or what exactly would happen next. It was, he recognized, the language of institutions being extremely careful in a situation where being extremely careful was the right posture, and also, probably, the most frustrating possible response to receive when you had just done something that had cost everything it had cost. But at the end, after the careful language and the careful non-commitments, There was a single line that was not in institutional language. It said, "The file on Zone 7 has been formally entered into the oversight record. It cannot be removed." He read that line several times. It cannot be removed. He thought about a Kareth actuarial model encountering a documented atrocity in its own administrative record. He thought about the specific calculus of an entity that valued thorough management, encountering a liability that could not be contained. He thought about what happened to organizations, human or otherwise, when the cost of proceeding became quantifiably higher than the cost of stopping. He didn't know. He didn't know what happened next. He knew what had happened today, and he knew what was in the record, and he knew that the processors in Zone 7 were still locked on life safety maintenance mode, and the water was still clean, and 6,143 people were still breathing. He knew that this was different from 4 months ago. He let himself feel that for exactly as long as it took to finish his water, and then he got up and went to work. The underground came to the bunker on the 3rd day after the broadcast. 12 people, from the cell 3 kilometers east, and they were different from the last time he'd contacted them. Not more numerous, not better armed, but changed in the specific way that people changed when they had stopped waiting to see if resistance was possible and started doing it. He recognized the change because he had felt it himself, once, a long time ago before Crosspoint, before the weight of what had happened had made him stop believing that what he did made any difference. He introduced Solis to them. He introduced Velashar. There was a silence, not a hostile one exactly, but the silence of 12 people encountering something that was outside every category they had prepared for, and needing a moment to decide which new category to build. He watched them looking at the Kareth archivist, at her dimmed communication organs held carefully at the amber of non-aggression, at the way she stood with the particular stillness of someone who understood exactly how much trust they were asking for, and was not going to rush the asking. Adiz spoke first. She had a way of speaking that cut straight to the load-bearing structure of a situation, which was why she was the de facto leader, which was why her cell had survived when others hadn't. "You're the one who built the broadcast package," Adiz said. Velashar's translator rendered her response. "I am the one who knew what format would enter the oversight record and not be dismissible. That is not the same thing as building it. That required all 3 of us." Adiz looked at her for a moment, then she looked at Dara. "Can she access the Zone 7 administrative network from here?" "With the right relay equipment, yes." "Can she access other zones?" He had not asked this. He looked at Velashar. A long pause. The bioluminescence cycled slowly. The translator gave him, with appropriate precautions, not immediately, in time. Adiz was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. "We have a list," she said finally, "of things we've been trying to find out for 2 years. Facility locations, quota schedules, transfer logs." She looked at Velashar steadily, not hostile, not warm, but with the specific careful attention of someone taking a measurement. "You would have access to that?" "Yes." "Why would you do this?" The bioluminescence shifted through several colors. The translator worked for a moment, then offered, "Because I was trained to believe that closing a file was the same as resolving it. I have found that this is not true." A pause. "And because someone told me that names are how you make the dead matter, I believe this is correct. I would like more names to remain alive long enough to be remembered by someone who knew them." The 12 people in the room were all looking at the archivist now. Adiz said, "We have a lot to do." "Yes," Velashar said through the translator. "I know." He went to find Velashar after the underground cell had left with their new list of questions and the outline of what came next. She was in the secondary chamber, standing at the terminal, looking at something. He stood in the doorway. She was looking at the faces. He watched her for a moment. The Karath had a particular characteristic when they encountered information that required processing beyond their existing categories. A slight shift in posture, a dimming of the communication organs to a frequency that was not quite any of the standard registers. Something that was not confusion, because their cognition didn't work that way, but was the closest thing to it that their biology expressed. She was standing like that. "He was the engineer," he said from the doorway. "With the zip ties, the one on the screen." She turned. Her translator gave him her response. "I know. I recognize his infrastructure registration from the archive. He submitted 17 emergency repair requests in the last 4 months before the occupation. All approved, all completed ahead of schedule." He hadn't known that. What was his name? Benedict Rao. A pause. He had a daughter. The educational records show she was enrolled in a specialist mathematics track. Another pause. He is listed as ceased in our processing records. Status: resource utilization complete. He looked at the face on the screen. Benedict Rao, who had filed 17 emergency repair requests and completed them all ahead of schedule, who had a daughter enrolled in a mathematics track. "That is what a closed file looks like," Velishar said. Her communication organs were very dim at a frequency he was starting to learn was the Karath version of something heavy sitting in the chest. Status: ceased. Resource: utilized. File closed. "Yes," he said. "And yours is different. Mine says this person existed. This is what they were. This is what they did. This is what mattered about them." A long silence. "Your kind has been doing this how long?" she said. "Since we had words," he said. "Maybe before." She looked at the screen for a long time. He watched the bioluminescence cycle through colors he didn't have translations for yet. He thought he was beginning to understand what those colors meant anyway. The same way you began to understand a language by context before you had the vocabulary, by the shape of when something was said and what preceded it and what it preceded. "In our administrative doctrine," she said finally, "grief is classified as a processing inefficiency, a distortion in actuarial modeling caused by over-indexing individual cessation events." A pause. "I have come to believe that this classification is wrong. Not wrong in the way an error is wrong. Wrong in the way a missing variable is wrong. The model gives you results that look coherent, but they are coherent only because you cannot see what you are not measuring." He thought about this. He thought about what it meant to have your foundational assumptions about grief rewritten from the outside. He thought about what that cost. "Are you all right?" he said. The bioluminescence shifted, quickly, to a color his translator had given him earlier in a different context. It rendered it now the same way it had then, something between asterisk unexpected and grateful. "I am processing," she said. "I believe I will be." A pause. "Thank you for asking." On the 4th morning after the broadcast, Dara sat in the outer chamber before anyone else was awake and opened the terminal and looked at the images. The faces of Novik stations dead, the civil engineer with the zip ties, the pediatric nurse and her 17 trips, the teacher and the sailor, and the woman with the improbable tomatoes. He thought about names and what they were for. He thought about the 6,143 names that were now attached to an administrative record sitting in the servers of the Federated Assembly Observer Mission, and the Karath Administrative Review Board and every independent monitoring body in the outer system. He thought about the specific act of attaching biographical data and photographs to a termination order, of making the dead, the not yet dead, the intended dead, specific and named and visible. He thought about a Karath archivist who had asked why humans made this particular kind of effort, and had written down the answer and had then, 11 months later, stood at a workstation in a substation in the lower Warrens and done it herself, with the precision of someone who had understood something that her training had not prepared her for. The door to the secondary chamber opened, and Solis came out. She had found clothes that fit better, A salvage run 2 days ago with 2 members of the underground cell. She had found shoes. She looked more like herself, he thought, though he only had 4 days of reference for what herself looked like. She looked less like someone at the end of something and more like someone at the beginning. She sat down across from him and looked at the terminal screen. "We should add them," she said. "The ones that survived, the ones from the facilities." He looked at her. "That's going to be a long list." "Yes," she said. She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her almost smile, and it landed in him somewhere specific and unexpected, the way a sound sometimes did when you were very tired and then very suddenly not tired, a sound that was nothing special and somehow exactly what was needed. "We have time," she said. He thought about whether that was true. He thought about temporary and pending review, and the long argument they were all going to have to keep making, in every format they could find, for as long as it took. He thought about the difference between surviving and living, and whether he had learned yet where that line was, and whether Crosspoint would ever stop being the weight that it was, and whether grief could be a compass long enough to get him somewhere worth going. He thought, keep moving, keep making the small, precise decisions. He turned back to the terminal and opened a new file. "Start with the engineer," he said, "the one with the zip ties." She looked at him. This time she actually smiled. "You remembered." "I remember all of them," he said. He started to type. Outside in the upper city in the processing facilities of Zone 7, 6,143 people breathed air that had been prevented from thinning, drank water that had been kept clean, waited in a cold that had not been made colder. They did not know why. They did not know the names of the people who had gone into a substation in the dark and done a specific thing with atmospheric processor codes and a broadcast package, and 6,143 names attached to a termination order like an argument, like a refusal, like a declaration of the one particular fact that the Kareth actuarial models had not been designed to account for. That humans do not stop counting their dead, that they remember, that they make the names matter. That this, specifically this, is not a weakness. He typed the engineer's name. He typed the specific story of the zip ties and the city block and the flooding. Then he typed the next name. Then the next. He kept going until the sun came up, in the way that it always came up over the occupied city, pale and cold and indifferent, a sun that did not know or care what had happened in a sublevel terminal room or what was happening now in a hidden bunker below the city's bones. The sun came up the same way it always had. The air was the same temperature it had always been. But 6,143 people were still breathing it. And somewhere in the outer system, a review board was reading a case, running the numbers, calculating. He kept typing,